We begin the New Testament about Jesus Christ, God become flesh as a man, and then we notice that women are also in place to keep very important roles. So we begin the New Testament about Jesus Christ, God who has become flesh, the flesh of man, and women are also in place to keep very important roles. Mary speaks of what God has already done. She says he has. She repeats it over and over. And like the women who returned from the tomb when Jesus Christ is resurrected, these women become the announcers of the history of Israel, just as they announce the future of Israel as well. They reveal how important it is for everyone to remember how blessed they've been in their lives. How blessed it is to live a life of faith, to live a life of blessing with the Holy Spirit. Do this in remembrance of me. We remember the blessings, we remember the gifts, the thanksgiving that we have to share, because God has been good to us and God has remembered God's promises. And God has promised to bless, to bless, to bless, and to bless. And these younger women, well, Mary certainly was younger. Elizabeth was in her mature age for childbirth. In fact, they thought she was past her menopause for Elizabeth. But still somehow God was able to bear fruit in Elizabeth's life as well as Mary's life, who was too young to be pregnant. How could these two women fulfill such great roles that God wanted to fulfill God's promises through these people, these women of faith? And God has helped and God has promised, God's fulfilled God's promises throughout the generations. God's answered even when things weren't going so well for the nation of Israel. Even when Israel's national leaders were getting into bad news scandals. How many of you remember David and Bathsheba as a scandal for the leaders of Israel? The history says that God, the Holy Father, still kept God's promises and kept hope alive even when the leaders of the nation were failing them. That God still kept hope alive and blessed the world through what was lowly, through what was looked over, what was passed over in the previous generations, now comes to the forefront, and we begin the gospel about Jesus Christ, not with the patriarchy of old, but with the matriarchy of the new, with the women who are strong in faith, with the women who speak the history of the nation, with the women who are looking forward to the new promises of God in their day. And we hear from them. We hear from Mary. We hear from Elizabeth. And Mary said, God has fulfilled promises. God did what God said God was going to do. But it turned out that it was humanity that hadn't fulfilled their half of the bargain. They hadn't fulfilled their promises that they promised. Oh yeah, God will do it. They let down God big time, infighting, patriarchal misogyny throughout the history of the church over and over again. And so it is with some surprise that new promises were needed and a new perspective would be heard from, and we hear it first from the women. The women who remembered how much trouble they'd been through in their history, their generations to generations, but also how to remember how blessed they have been. How blessed they have been. Now let me tell this story just a little bit, because when Ms. Dora came in here this morning, I want to talk about Ms. Dora here for a second. She came in here looking like she's been hurt. She says, my arms, Pastor, I can barely move my arms. I've just been to the doctor. Before it was my knees. But then it's my shoulders, I can barely move. But Pastor, I'm blessed, she says to me. She says, it was my knees, it was my shoulders, but Pastor, I'm blessed. It's that kind of remembrance of what blessings we have that keep us moving forward with hope into the future. It is that kind of blessings that have the matriarchal stamp of Ms. Dora and the generations that she is blessed, because she keeps that in focus no matter if she's feeling run down and tired. She knows that there is hope and that there is blessing in giving thanks for how much God has blessed us in our lives. How can we remember to count our blessings each and every day, especially when we come upon hard times, especially when we are part of this religious nation that has gone through such turmoil in its history? How can we keep our focus on the hope and the promises of love and resurrection that Jesus Christ has shared with the world in the midst of so much pain and hurt in our lives and the life of the world? Well, our Bible helps us to deal with it by beginning the New Testament not with bad news, but with good news. Good news that God is ready to do a new thing, and it begins, strangely enough, with something new in the story. You see, the Holy Spirit, it's mentioned only twice. That phrase, Holy Spirit's mentioned only twice in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, we receive the Holy Spirit over 100 times, and it is first recognized when it is given to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, in verse 41, was filled with the Holy Spirit. Women not only begin this gospel, but are also the first ones to receive the Holy Spirit, and this is a game changer in the history of religion. This should surprise us that the Holy Spirit first comes to those who were lowly, who were overlooked, who were part of the ones that were poor and hungry. That God comes into this world not with a judgment of anger, but with a blessing of spirit. And God comes to bless us when we've been beaten down by poor leaders, when we've been struggling through a world of disasters and pain, when we've experienced loss. God comes to us to give us the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit to revive our souls again. And this is the game changer, that in fact this new story begins not with just the Son of Man, but also with the women, with those who were the part of the story from the beginning. It says Abraham and his descendants, but what about Sarah? She got a part of the promise too, right? Sarah and Abraham were both promised that their ancestry would be descendants forever for God. And we remember to keep this in perspective, because the Holy Spirit is neither male nor female. The Holy Spirit doesn't push the balance of God onto one side or the other. The Holy Spirit actually helps balance out the world in the midst of an imbalance of power, an imbalance of judgment. The Holy Spirit is meant to help balance us out. And the way the Holy Spirit works here with Elizabeth and Mary is that the Holy Spirit reminds them to give thanks for the blessings in their lives. My legs hurt, my shoulders hurt, but I'm blessed. To live into that remembrance of how blessed we have been is the goal of the New Testament, is the goal of these stories to remind us that we have been blessed, that we are blessed, and we can share that blessing as a light to others in this world as we reflect, as we magnify that this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine and magnify it into the world through our own actions. Elizabeth said, "For as soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leaped for joy." And in some ways, this is what we need even more now, this leaping for joy. And we need light years to leap ahead also for equality between male and female, equality between those who have been the bearers of God's news and those who have borne the brunt of serving God's people. And we need the Holy Spirit to help us be patient and kind with one another, to help us respect one another because of the gift of God in each other. Not because of a gender or because of a powerful situation or because of a title, but because of the gift of God, that Holy Spirit that is shared by God, that blessing that we remember that others have been blessed even as we have been, and we are to respect that blessing in others, just as Mary and Elizabeth respect one another's blessing of a baby in their lives. We need leaps forward in gender equality still today. As much as the New Testament saw it happening in their day, 2,000 years haven't equaled the level playing field yet. We still need to hear more. And I was yesterday at the Christmas party at my father's house, remembering how I needed to double check what I was going to say for my sermon today. And so I pulled out my computer, was looking at my sermon, and then I realized I need to be listening to the women and the children in this house of people. And so I set my computer down and I went to my sister-in-law, to go listen and to be with them and to listen to how much hurt they've been through. My sister-in-law with the loss of her husband, my sister still reeling from the loss of my mother, and I as well from both of those pains. But to hear it from their perspective, to hear how they are still resilient, how they still have hope, how they are still raising their children with faith and with goodness, even in the midst of a world that isn't going to pay them the same rate that it pays a male of their same age and experience. In a world that does not value equality, but pressures us to put a premium on malehood over femalehood. Now with my daughter, I hope to live the gospel. I hope to let my daughter know that she will have a voice in this world that is equal to any man's voice, and that as she sings about God's history and God's promises and God's hope, that she will be heard by those who are listening, including all those men and women of faith. And so today we spend a special part of our worship remembering the voices of women, remembering the voices of the children, remembering God's hope in the midst of pain, in the midst of our grieving, in the midst of our troubles. We remember God's Holy Spirit has come, and it was promised that God fulfills God's promises, and that there is still hope for blessings yet to come. So, we are going to sing. Our hymn of the day is the Magnificat, as we sing with Mary, the mother of Jesus, about what is coming into the world through her own life and through ours. Let us stand together as we sing the Magnificat.